Hello everyone, I'm joining you today from my kitchen. I've decided to do this live because it uploads a lot quicker than when I'm pre-recording them, and you can still watch it later, so you don't have to be watching it live. So today's lesson, I just wanted to take some time to consolidate the work that I asked you to do last time. So that was work on the contribution of children to the domestic division of labour, and also the contribution of grandparents and how that's made a difference to the way that labour is divided. And then also moving on to looking at power relationships as well, which means that we can then think about moving on to finishing off that 20-mark question that I asked you to have a look at last week, so that you can hand that in. Okay, so first things first, the study you were asked to look at was Brannan and his understanding of how children now contribute a lot more to domestic work. So how younger people, and it really, the study does actually focus mostly on people aged 16. So it's not, I suppose, children, but young adults, young members of the family, and how they are doing more in terms of contributing to contributing to the domestic division of labour. So Brannan found that they are contributing more. And of course, that then takes some of the impact off of the mother figure in the family, the woman's role in the family. So that would be a good way, I would suggest, of evaluating a point about how women take on like the dual burden, and how things are much harder for women than for men, because you could suggest that times are changing and children are starting to take on more and more responsibilities as well. However, one thing that was noted by Brannan, which I think is important, is that there's still this like difference between the sexes, difference between the genders. So gendered division of labour, whereby even in young people, young girls are doing more than young boys in the home. So some of you might not be surprised to hear that, some of you might be, but Brannan's studies suggest that young girls are more willing to take part in the housework and domestic division of labour. And also perhaps that parents are more likely to ask the girls to do it. Perhaps it's seen as like more their duty and expectation of them. There's also ethnic differences. For example, Brannan has found that Asian girls are the most likely to be involved in housework and looking after the family. So you can take from that what you wish, really. It could be that this is due to Asian families having more traditional expectations in terms of the family and in terms of the genders, and therefore the women are expected to do more of the work. So I guess they're sort of preparing almost their young girls for when they're going to do the most of the domestic labour when they're older. Brannan also found in other studies that Asian parents are really strict on their daughters, and that might be part of it too, and that they're not sort of pushed in a different direction to have a career and that kind of thing as much as Asian boys would be. Okay, so that's all very interesting. And as I say, that can fit into the debate by using it as a bit of an evaluative point with regards to the division of labour, by saying that we can actually broaden it beyond looking at the adults in the couple, and we can actually start to take into account the children as well and how they might contribute. And then very importantly, more and more grandparents are being involved in this domestic division of labour, particularly in terms of childcare in particular. So this is really important because it reflects the fact that there are more grandparents around than there would have been in the past because of longer life expectancy and the lower death rate. So it's much more likely that grandparents are part of their grandchildren's lives than it would have been in the past. So this suggests that they are helping out in the domestic division of labour. So again, it's about like broadening the discussion beyond just looking at the couple in the nuclear family, and instead looking at other people that are contributing. So a good evaluative point as well, that things are changing and perhaps the burden of childcare is not so much placed on the woman anymore, because instead the grandparents are shouldering some of that load, I guess. So yes, very good point. Would definitely recommend that you mention that if you are asked about domestic division of labour today, because it's, as I say, it's very relevant to today. Okay, so then power relationships is the next sort of topic area to look at. So when we talk about power, we're talking about someone's ability to influence someone else and someone's ability to make decisions and exert their will over others. That's what we mean by power. So straight away, you might be thinking that you have some ideas yourself about who is most powerful in relationships. And feminism and society really teaches us that men are more likely to have the most power. And that might be because of sort of historical ideas about men being physically stronger, but also very much it would be very much situated in the idea that men have traditionally been the ones to work and earn a wage. So they therefore have more power and control over financial things, which they may also, according to some sociologists, then use as a means of controlling their wives through the kind of threat of losing that financial security. Okay, so a few things though that suggest that things are changing in terms of power, although it may be slowly. So your first key thinker here is Edgell. And Edgell found that decision-making in the home is divided, where men make the most important decisions. So this would be your point to support the view that the power relationships are unequal, because he found that the women were only allowed to make the least important decisions, like what's for dinner, what clothes the children wear, and those kinds of things. Whereas the big decisions like moving home, etc., the man would have control over, mostly financial things. Whereas Pahl and Vogler found something slightly different. They argued that traditionally, as in before, they're kind of noting how things have changed. They're saying that it used to be the case that couples would have an allowance system whereby the man would be the only one earning the money. So they would say to the wife, you have this much money for the food, and then you can have this much if you want to go out with your friends. The old, like, here you go and buy something nice for yourself, that old-fashioned kind of thing. So nowadays, though, they argue that people are more likely to have a pooling system, which basically is a joint bank account. So they're suggesting that instead of the man having all of the money, the woman now is likely to earn as well, and that both of those partners are likely to put all of their money into one account and completely share everything. So this would suggest that there's a bit more equality in terms of sharing the power and the financial power and the financial decision making, in that it's become a lot more joint. But as it says in your pack, research from 2011 found that although 59% of married couples consult each other on financial issues, only 44% of women have sole responsibility for financial decisions. So it's still less likely for a woman to have sole control over the finances. Take of that what you will. That's a huge growth from in the past when that would have been 0%. So massive progress. And I guess really what you'd expect is to see that, I don't know, like, I guess this is suggesting that you want to see all women having complete control over their finances, but people make different choices for different reasons. So it's more complicated than that. And this is where Weeks comes in. Weeks argues that there's a growing way of doing things. There's a growing trend towards this idea of co-independence. Now, this is where each partner earns their own money. They put a certain amount of it into a joint account for bills and whatnot, but then they keep their own money for spending on things that they want. So I think this is quite common. Like I do this, and most of my friends do this because, you know, I earn money, I want to keep it for myself and spend it on things that I want to spend it on. You don't always want to consult your partner if you just want to go and like get a haircut or go out for drinks with a friend or treat yourself to something. So this means that in terms of the joint things, people are still having this like joint bank account where the bills come out of any joint stuff, but they're also keeping their own money. And Weeks calls this co-independence because it's not codependent. They're not dependent on each other. They've got a degree of independence, but they've also got a degree of cooperation, collaboration. Okay, so it's also important that we think about violence in terms of power relationships and why it would seem that violence is always is more likely to be committed against women. Now, Dobash and Dobash argue that this is because marriage basically legitimates this unequal power relationship whereby the man has power over the woman, and that then legitimates them using violence to exert that power. And Dobash actually found that most of the violence that was taking place in the families that they studied, it was due to women stepping out of their subordinate role, if you like, and the men not liking it and using violence as a way of getting their power and control back. So Dobash and Dobash's study would suggest that there is an unequal power relationship. Donovan also found that domestic violence is a significant problem in same-sex couples as well. Younger couples are more likely to have domestic violence occur within them. And materialist explanations suggest that the violence between couples is often due to material factors within the home, as in worrying about money. So that would suggest that that might be a class issue as well. Is there more likely to be domestic violence in lower class families where money is more of a stress and maybe more of a source of conflict? So that's important. Domestic violence does occur in same-sex couples too. So again, that would suggest that it's not just necessarily a patriarchy, like man against woman thing. We have to take it beyond that and think about other types of couples that are more common now as well. Okay, so in your pack, on page 70, you have got a key thinker list where I would like you to have a go at summarising each of the views of the key thinkers from this whole section. Do this before you start doing this essay that I'm going to set you, because this is a good bit of revision to make sure you've got all of the ideas in your head. And then the second one underneath is to flip it the other way and see the concepts and try and give the names of the key thinkers that are relevant to it. So have a go at both of those, and then also do this activity on page 71, because that will be really useful in terms of sorting the ideas into whether they support the view that things are becoming more equal or they go against the view that things are becoming more equal. Now, some of them you might feel don't really fit into either category, I guess, because you could say that, like, let's say Gershony and lagged adaptation. Gershony is arguing that things are becoming more equal, but that they're not there yet. In that situation, I would put Gershony in both columns, and I would put Gershony, lagged adaptation, progress in the equal column. And then I'd put, however, Gershony, not fully equal yet, lagged adaptation in the second, in the no column. So ignore like the lines of the rows if there ends up being more or less. Don't worry about that. Just make sure you've got your two columns of yes and no, and fit in as much as you can. And that will help you with this essay. So the essay question that I asked you to look at is this one about DDOL and power relationships. It's about both of them. And so I did give you, and I will try and put this in, I'll send it to you in as well. So the question, The question is: apply material from item B in your knowledge. Evaluate the view that the division of labour and power relationships in couples are equal in modern family life. So in the last video, I was talking about how you can't really talk about the power relationships. You couldn't at the time because you hadn't studied it, but now you have. So now you can do those last couple of paragraphs. And if you wanted to, you can even go back and add in and think about ways to add in the arguments about children and also grandparents in the earlier paragraphs about DDOL, domestic division of labour. So the second half of your essay then is going to be based on power relationships. I would recommend here that you, actually I'm not recommending, I am telling you that you need to start with this idea that power relationships are equal in modern family life. So you need to kind of try and talk about, for example, how things have improved. So you might want to talk about how Parl and Vogler talk about this pooling and how Weeks talks about co-independence as a sign that financially power relationships are becoming more equal. And then you need to evaluate. So you may evaluate with the idea that even though things are changing with this pooling situation, often the women are really unlikely to have sole control over the finances, and men still seem to make the most important decisions. And you could also then say, although that there's like a bit more financial equality, Edgel's research suggests that men still make the most important financial decisions. So that could suggest that power isn't necessarily equal. Just because they're having a joint bank account, the men are still having the decision-making power. And then for the last paragraph, you don't necessarily have to start with it being equal and then disagree. In this one, you may want to do a bit of a focus on domestic violence. And this is a really good opportunity to use some studies and contemporary issues as well. So you could talk about Dobash and Dobash's study showing that there seems to be more violence against women, which might suggest that there is a patriarchal power relationship between men and women in which men are the more powerful. You can then link to issues like, for example, Dobash and Dobash's study, issues like the rise in domestic violence of men against women due to the World Cup. And some of you, I think, have found some statistics. You don't have to use this, maybe a bit close to home at the minute, but about kind of violence happening within the home more due to the coronavirus lockdown. So if you can get some contemporary issues in there, that's great. Don't have to describe it in lots of detail, just literally, for example, this can be seen in the rise in domestic violence during the World Cup, where most of the violence was men against women, something like that. And then your evaluation, you're going to have to think a bit outside the box for this one, and start thinking about giving perhaps even your own views and things you've been talking to me about in class. Often people in class say, but what about violence against men? What about violence in same-sex couples? And obviously Donovan has found that there is also violence in same-sex couples. So it's not just about kind of heterosexual couples. You can evaluate the point in that way. And you might suggest that the rise in violence of women against men is actually a sign of power relationships changing and becoming more equal. Now, obviously, we're not celebrating more violence as a good thing, but what we can say is that if more women are violent towards men, then that's a change in the trend of the power relationship, that more women are feeling like the powerful member of the partnership. Hope that makes sense. I'm going to write it down briefly in the PowerPoint slide and then send it over to you as a plan. Because if you remember, your marked piece of work is that I want you to write out an answer in full to the 20-mark question. So I'm giving you the plan and I want you to write it out in full and get that over to me by the end of the week, please. So yeah, you're using most of your lesson really today to make a start on that, because I've been talking for 20 minutes, I'm pretty much done. So you've got basically an hour to have a go at writing it. Don't make it too long, please. Maybe try and do your plan and then try and write it in the designated time, which would be half an hour. Because I don't want to read anything that's really, really long. And I don't mean that in the sense that I'm being lazy, but it's a waste of your time and therefore a waste of my time too, because in the exam, you won't be able to have that much time. So there's no point. Just try and do it in the amount of time that you would in the exam next year. What I would also like you to do, just to finish off, is page 72. We've got a lovely key concepts grid. Have a go at that as a bit of a revision test. And there is a 10 marker. I'm not going to say that you have to do that, but if you want to and you want to send it over to me, then that is fine. Next lesson, we're going to be moving on to looking at demography, which is kind of like human geography, if you've done that before. It's thinking about population changes and stuff. So if you want, then you could start having a think about things like the birth rate and the death rate. What do you think's happened to them? Do a bit of research into demographic trends would be the thing to search for, demographic trends in the UK. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I'll send you over some notes and things, and yeah, enjoy. Thanks.